Right, then let's get started with a sentence I hope you recognize. Ellen sila lumen momenti elvo. A star shines on the hour of our meeting. This is the very first sentence in Elvish that readers of J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy encounter. Though there are foreign words before that, for example, hobbit, this greeting is the first hint that readers are not merely dealing with invented names for people, places, and things with no deeper structure behind them, as was commonly the case before and still is after Tolkien's books. What they find instead are several constructed languages the author invented himself, with varying levels of depth and detail. Tolkien's most developed languages, Quenya and Sindarin, have their own vocabularies, grammar, and writing systems, and are also part of a family of Elvish languages with their own internal history. Even after all these years and a proliferation of professionally developed languages in the wake of Tolkien's trilogy, Quenya and Sindarin are still regarded as the paramount examples of constructed languages done right. In my talk for the Tolkien seminar series this semester, I will be giving you an overview of the invented languages found in J.R.R. Tolkien's novels, and then I'll be giving you an overview of how they are used in adaptations of his writings. Just as they have a detailed internal history, Tolkien's languages went through countless iterations and were technically never finished, as he frequently went back and changed things. While it is relatively easy to transfer information from the previous stages to the languages in the book, they are not identical. According to Helmut Pesch, for example, much of the early languages Noldorin and Goldokrin are identical with Sindarin, as in The Lord of the Rings, but neither they nor their position in the system are identical with those from Middle-earth as they are known today. Tolkien's languages can be sorted along a spectrum from his two most developed languages, Sindarin and Quenya, to languages for which only a handful of words are known, such as the language of the Dunlendings. Sometimes Tolkien, or rather the narrator of his novels, gives us descriptions of what these languages sound like to people who do not speak them, such as when Eomer compares the language of the Dunlendings to the sounds of beasts and birds. Some languages, like that of the Halethrim, are only mentioned, and we don't know any words if they exist. And since it is likely that not all of Tolkien's writings have been discovered or made public, it is possible that there are even more languages than those you can currently see. According to Patrick Schmitz and David Graziano, it is crucial that readers of a fantastical work of fiction are eased over the threshold into the secondary world. This is accomplished during the first 100 pages of The Lord of the Rings through the Shire's many similarities to England, particularly the personal names, which sound mostly English and thus familiar. Once this threshold has been crossed, Tolkien gradually raised the otherness, leading up to the Elvish greeting from the beginning of this presentation in many more exotic linguistic forms. Reading comprehension is further made easier by the coupling of a foreign term with its English translation, which helps anchor them in the reader's memory. The context in which a term is presented can also affect memorability and comprehension. Most of Tolkien's languages take the form of names for characters, places, races, things, and concepts. Often the translation of a word or words is provided right before or after, either in the form of literal translation or paraphrases. On occasion, the text does not make it obvious that the information given about a term is actually its translation. Sometimes the literal or near exact translation can take the form of an epithet that comes after a non-English first name. Orthanc is an interesting example to consider, as it actually has two meanings depending on which language you read it in. In Sindarin, Orthanc translates to Mount Fang, and in the language of the Rohirrim, which Tolkien replaced with Old English as part of the translation scheme of his frame narrative, it means cunning mind. Tolkien himself talked about the double meaning in The Unfinished Tales and calls it an accident. This example also shows that Middle-earth is a multilingual world in which places often have multiple names in the different languages, such as Khazad-dûm, which is also known as Hafodrond or Moria, Torodelf, and Khazar-Rondo. This also applies to entire peoples, objects, concepts, noteworthy events, and personal names and titles, as with the many names of the formerly Grey and then later White Wizard, commonly known as Gandalf. Finally, there are also terms that are only alluded to or described, and for a number of words, partial or even no translation is provided anywhere. This results in what Ria Chain calls empty signifiers without any meaning attached to them. What sets Tolkien's novels and languages apart from those found in other works of fantasy and science fiction is that we not only find words, but also sentences with clearly discernible grammars that can be translated if you have the tools for it. We find sentences in Quenya, Sindarin, the famous ring inscription verse in the Black Speech, Old English or the language of the Rohirrim, and Khusdul. Even more sentences have been found in works published after Tolkien's death, including in languages not found in his novels, for example in Telerin, one of the Elven languages. And we not only find sentences, but longer passages such as poems, hymns, and songs. Again, in Sindarin, in Quenya, for example, the lament Namarie, the written form of which you can see on the right side of the slide. The trilingual praises on the fields of Cormalen, which are sung in Westron or English, Sindarin, and Quenya. And again, more have been found in works published after Tolkien's death, for example, the lament of Akabeleth in Adunaic, the ancestral language of the men of Westerness or Númenor. What the cover of The Road Goes Ever On also shows is that Tolkien has also invented his own writing systems. The Tengwa originally developed for Quenya, such as Galadriel's lament, as well as the Kyrth runes, which have then later been adopted by the dwarves. The example found in the novel is the inscription of Onbalin's tomb in Moria. In a universe with as many languages as Middle-earth, it is no wonder that the topic itself is also talked about. One of the central themes in the novels, in my opinion, is bilingualism or multilingualism as opposed to monolingualism. The former two are typical among elves, dwarves, ents, orcs, and many men, particularly those of Númenorian descent and the Rohirrim, but not hobbits, who are largely, but not exclusively, monolingual. However, there are exceptions. For example, most of the inhabitants of Lothlorien do not speak Westron because they do not deal with outsiders very often. Westron serves as the lingua franca amongst most of the peoples of the West, which explains why almost all characters speak it. Among the elves, and formerly between elves and dwarves, Sindarin occupied a similar position. Among the Dunedain and Númenorians, the Elvish tongues were taught and spoken besides their own native language, Adunaic, until they were outlawed before the kingdom's fall. Similarly, Thingol, first king of the Sindar, forbade Quenya to be spoken in his realm after learning of the kinslaying in Alqualonde. Multilingualism among orcs is treated differently by the appendices. We are told that orcs had no language of their own, but took what they could of other tongues and perverted it to their own liking, and that being filled with malice, hating even their own kind, the orcs quickly developed as many barbarous dialects as there were groups or settlements of their race, so that their orcish speech was of little use to them in intercourse between different tribes. Consequently, they adopted Westron for intertribal communication as their own lingua franca, but in such a fashion as to make it hardly less unlovely than Orcish. Interestingly, it is because they have to use Westron between different tribes that Merry and Pippin are able to understand the orcs while they are captured, as well as Sam when he overhears the two orc chieftains in Cirith Ungol. This is one of the many examples of the languages serving a narrative function in Tolkien's novels. According to Sheridan Branshaw, some of these moments show the successes and failures of philology both as a discipline and a mindset. One example are Gandalf's attempts to open the gate of Moria, Pedo Melon Amino, speak friend and enter. The solution was right there, yet he thinks too much about philology and thus fails to see that he simply needs to say melon or friend in Sindarin. Branshaw names another example, Faramir's failure to translate Cirith Ungol, and points out that him not translating the name and thus forewarning Frodo and Sam that they might find spiders there is connected to the idea that with the elves' departure from Middle-earth and the subsequent decline of the languages among the men, much knowledge and lore will be forgotten. Elvish also serves another function within the legendarium. It appears as a saving grace that protects those speaking it from danger and evil, such as when Frodo and Sam speak Quenya and Sindarin respectively to make the fire of Galadriel glow. If the Elvish tongues are the languages of good and salvation, then the Black speech can be seen as their opposite. In terms of its function, it was meant as a tool for control and erasure of individual languages and identities. But, as we know, it failed even among most of his servants. The concept of language as something that binds people together is found numerous times in the legendarium in the form of multilingualism in Westron, as I already mentioned. But I want to highlight one case in particular, in which language is instrumental in bridging a gap between two seemingly disparate people, namely when Galadriel uses the Khuzdul names of the mountains when speaking to Gimli. And the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw their love and understanding. The next two functions I identify go hand in hand: world building, the construction of an imaginary world, and immersion. Tolkien created Middle-earth and gave this world its own geography, history, cultures, and of course, languages. The degree of development of an imaginary, or as Tolkien himself called it, secondary world, can differ significantly from author to author. But in the case of Middle-earth, the degree and quality set a new standard and make it seem real. Immersion refers to the idea that readers mentally enter the fictional world presented by a work of fiction as they read it. For this to take place, the world needs to be developed enough that the readers are not only to imagine it in sufficient detail, but also are able to pretend that the world exists and that they are a part of it. Tolkien himself called this concept secondary belief in his essay on fairy stories. The languages greatly contribute to immersion overall in the perceived realness of Middle-earth. It is important to note here that Tolkien believed that invented languages work even if readers cannot actually understand them. The sound of a language can provide a lot of information about its speakers and their culture, and thus make the people seem more realistic and three-dimensional. Often, readers will be reminded of the phonologies of natural languages. Both the shape and sound of words can trigger emotional responses. These associations are very subjective and depend on the reader's sociolinguistic background, as well as on the design intentions of the language inventor. These associations are often based on cultural stereotyping, as they are based on a connection between the speakers of the fictional language and the speakers of a natural language in our world, of which readers are then reminded. In Tolkien's world, in addition, there is a correlation between the sound of a language and the character of its speakers, and this connection is very deliberate. Tolkien chose sounds he personally found enjoyable for the languages of his generally good races, and sounds he disliked for those spoken by the forces of evil. To briefly move away from Tolkien to the author of a different popular fantasy book series, George R.R. Martin. Prior to the release of the first episode of the TV show adapting his Song of Ice and Fire novels, Martin wrote on his blog that methods he used in his books, for example, they set in Dothraki, would not work in television, since you actually have to hear what the characters are saying, even if you don't necessarily understand the words. So when the pilot was filmed, HBO, the company behind the adaptation Game of Thrones, brought in a world-class expert to create a Dothraki tongue that went well beyond my Khalisi and Khalasar. What this quote shows is that there is a difference between invented languages used in a written medium like a book and those used in audio or audiovisual media like television. And this is also true for the many adaptations of Tolkien's writings, of which there are indeed quite a few, ranging from audiobooks and radio plays to a graphic novel, a musical, different types of movies, TV shows, video games, role-playing games, board games, and so forth. And now I will be giving you a very brief overview of how Tolkien's languages are used in these adaptations. Unsurprisingly, audiobooks include all passages, which includes songs, poems, and lines in languages other than English. Thus, it is more interesting to, for example, look at radio dramatizations, and here to look for what they include and what they do not include. When it comes to the novel The Hobbit, there is very little material to work with when it comes to Tolkien's languages. We have Gandalf's sign on the door of Bilbo's hobbit hole. We have the runes, the moon letters, and names such as Orcrist and Glumdring, the two swords, as well as translations of these names. Just yesterday, I was in the BBC written archive and looked at the scripts of old adaptations of Tolkien's writings. One of them being The Hobbit, abridged by Barbara Henderson, which played during the Children's Hour in 1961, and comparing that to the proper Hobbit radio dramatization, also by the BBC from 1968, and the American radio dramatization from 1979 by The Mind's Eye. There are some minor differences. For example, the Henderson version does not mention the symbol Gandalf carves on the door, but it does talk about the runes, as do the other two radio dramatizations. The 1968 Hobbit radio dramatization is further interesting because it uses lines not found in The Hobbit, but actually taken from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. For example, whenever Gandalf lights a staff or makes fire, he recites parts of the spells he tries to open the Gate of Moria in the Fellowship of the Ring. And when Thorin and company join the Battle of Five Armies, they shout Baruk Khazad, which is the dwarvish battle cry from the Two Towers. There is a lot more language material to work with in The Lord of the Rings, and this is reflected in the 3 radio dramatizations, 2 of which are from the BBC and 1 again from The Mind's Eye. And here it is interesting to look at which passages they include and which they do not include. And when you compare the 2 BBC adaptations to that by The Mind's Eye, you see that the BBC included a lot more than the American version, in which we only get the translation of the ring verse in the Black speech. The hymn to Elbereth isn't sung at all, and neither is Mareike, though all 3 adaptations have Gandalf's attempts to open the gate, and the 2 of the radio dramatizations which get to the fields of Cormoran, which the 1955 one doesn't, unfortunately. Both of them include all the 3 languages. In general, when it comes to the Sindarin and Quenya lines, in the 2 BBC radio plays, we find the most important lines and terms. though there are a few non-essential for the overall plot omissions. In comparison, in the Mind's Eye adaptation, with only one exception, we only get the translations. That exception being Glorfindel's call to his horse Asfalov Novolim. When it comes to lines and words not from Quenya in Sindarin, some are included and others not. The Mind's Eye radio play and the BBC 1981 play both use the term Nazgul for ringwraiths, which the 1955 adaptation does not, but both omit the Kustul names for the Misty Mountains, which is included in the 1955 version, though the multi-syllabic words are shortened to either only the first part of the name or only to the last part. And all three sadly remove the exchange between Galadriel and Gimli I quoted to you before. What all audio adaptations have in common is that none of them, by virtue of their medium, are able to show writing, and thus have to describe what can be shown through images in the novels, such as the ring inscription or the writing of the gates of Durin. The opposite problem is found in visual adaptations such as the 1990 Hobbit graphic novel illustrated by David Wenzel, in which all writing is shown, as you can see, for example, on the map, both the runes and the moon letters, but of course we don't hear the languages being spoken. Writing in general is everywhere, especially the ring inscription or the writing on the doors of Durin and Balin's tomb. For video games, which is everything below the blue line, often, but not always, the languages, or more specifically the writing, will be relevant to the gameplay, for example as puzzles or as part of the user interface with which players interact. In some cases, though, the writing systems are relegated to decoration, and in many, but not all cases, trying to translate the writing reveals that they are either complete gibberish or English written in Tengwa or Kioth. Writing is also found in the Lord of the Rings musical, which first ran in 2007 and then had a brief rerun in 2023. Here, writing was projected onto the back of the stage, more specifically the ring inscription and the writing on the gates of Moria. When it comes to the languages overall, we find many lines and even whole songs in Tolkien's languages. For example, the text in Korean is the prologue song sung by Arwen, completely in Sindarin, but you also find Quenya, the Black speech, and Old English. Including Tolkien's languages was very important to the creators of the original run of the musical. Laurie Battle, the Tolkien creative consultant, said that the idea of having the elves speak and sing in Elvish at key moments was enticing, but the subject had to be handled with care. And so they consulted experts and worked together with the Tolkien estate. Sean McKenna, the writer and lyricist of the musical, said that before he did any research, he imagined he could just make up any old nonsense and none would be the wiser, but then learned that people in fact know what Elvish is supposed to sound like, and there are even people who communicate in Elvish. However, the inclusion doesn't seem to have worked for either the hardcore Tolkien language fans, who criticized the pronunciation, sentence construction, and the use of non-canonical words, or general musical goers, such as Nick Hudson, a podcaster, who questioned the inclusion of incomprehensible songs in a medium in which songs give insight into characters' motivations, feelings, and even the plot. The advantage of adaptations that are not viewed in real time, such as motion picture or video games, is that they can include subtitles. Though in the case of the earliest video games from the 80s and early 90s, they were basically all subtitles because they were strictly text-based and could not display any images at all. These generally included the principal names and mentioned the writing, though, as I mentioned, they were unable to show it. This changed in the late 80s and early 90s when the first static images were added, then two-dimensional, and finally three-dimensional environment and characters were found. These games differ significantly in how much of Tolkien's languages they include. J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 1 by Interplay Productions from 1994, for example, includes the languages in its gameplay in the form of riddles and uses words other than those central to Tolkien's novels. For example, in one of the riddles the player has to solve in Khazad-dûm, they have to find out the name that the dwarves give to their maker, whom the elves call Aule. They might have found that solution earlier in a random text found in that area, but were given no indication that it is the solution to a riddle. If the player already knows that the name is Mahal, then they would likely remember that information when the game asks for it. This is, however, the exception and not the rule. Most of the video games from this era and also later ones only use the most important terms and use the writing as what I would call set dressing. In the 2000s then, depending on the hardware and console you used, voice acting was introduced, and thus the languages were heard just like in the radio dramatizations and the earliest movies. Video games based on Peter Jackson's movie trilogies have many advantages compared to those not based on the movies. They can draw not only from voice lines directly from the movies, but in some cases even worked with the actors and recorded new lines. They can also draw on the work done by David Salo, a linguist and Tolkien language specialist who worked on the Peter Jackson movies. Regardless of if they were only text-based, included rudimentary images, or had voice acting, what sets video games apart from the novels, radio plays, and graphic novel is the element of interactivity and immersion, by which I mean the feeling most players get that it almost seems like they are part of the world, which is heightened compared to the novels as they control the player character directly. This process is made easier by identification with the player characters, be they from the novels or original ones created by the game developers. The identification is even stronger in games in which the player is able to create their own character. This is the case in the massively multiplayer online role-playing game The Lord of the Rings Online, which first launched in 2007 and is still going strong. They use a lot of written and spoken language material, both canonical and original, as well as their own writing systems and languages for the many peoples of Middle-earth, often but not always based on real languages of our world. The Shadow of Mordor game and its sequel, Shadow of War, as well as The Lord of the Rings Gollum and The Lord of the Rings The Return to Moria, did what Jackson did and hired Tolkien language expert to work with them on the languages in their games. The Shadow of games and Return to Moria worked with David Salo, while The Lord of the Rings Gollum worked with Helmut Pesch. In this game in particular, there are lines of dialogue during video sequences, so-called cutscenes, in which elves and orcs speak subtitles in Sindarin and Black speech respectively. However, if they also want to hear the background characters in Mirkwood speak Sindarin, they either have to pay €5 for the language pack or buy the premium edition of the game. Otherwise, this background dialogue is all in English. This has, unsurprisingly, been criticized for putting the immersion and world building behind a paywall, literally. In board games and card games, we also find a lot of Tolkien's languages, primarily in the form of book quotes on cards as so-called flavor text. They also use a lot of the names and terms and include a lot of the writing, be that as decoration on the cards, specific sections of the game board, in drawings or pictures, such as the one on the bottom right, in which a dwarf is writing Kiev runes onto the wall, or they might even have gameplay relevance. The Lord of the Rings adventure card game and the Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth, both of which are developed by Fantasy Flight Games, stand out in particular because they are story-based and have role-playing elements, again leading back to this idea of identification with the player characters and heightened immersion. This is even more true for so-called role-playing games, which, if you know Dungeons and Dragons, it's the same kind of game with differences, but the overall gist of it is similar. This type of game relies on the imagination of the players and their willingness and interest to include the languages. In rulebooks, storybooks, and other official material published by the developers, the languages are generally mentioned and explained. And for so-called non-player characters, their information often includes what languages they speak and how well they speak those languages. I want to highlight two of these games in particular. For one, The One Ring, first published by Cubicle 7 and then Free League Publishing, because it includes sentences from Tolkien's novels. For example, the Quenya greeting from the beginning of this talk. And to go back further in time, in the 80s and 90s, there was a role-playing game called Middle-earth Role-Playing by Iron Crown Enterprises. Not only did they use a lot of material from Tolkien's languages, but also included a lot of original terms, names, groups, and languages. And at the beginning of each of their published books, they claim to have been very strict about whether their own inventions fit into Tolkien's established canon. And we've heard that names a couple of times already. They worked together with David Salo, so he could develop the languages and make sure everything was correct to the canon of Tolkien's works. And this was, as you can see, before David Salo worked with Peter Jackson on his movies. Speaking of movies, for the earliest movie adaptations and TV shows, it is similar to radio dramatizations, namely a game of what is left in, what is cut out. The vast majority include most of the central lines from the novels, though most remove the songs like Elbereth or Mareike. The exception here is the Swedish mini-TV series Sagan om Ringen, in which the hymn to Elbereth is sung. If you've seen the Hobbit movie by Rembrandt Films from 1967, you would know that it made a lot of changes to the plot of The Hobbit, but it made heavy use of the runes everywhere throughout the short film. This stands in contrast to the Russian The Fabulous Journey of Mr. Bilbo Baggins, The Hobbit from 1985, in which there is no mention of the runes, moon letters, there is no Elrond and no wood elves. As we'll see again later, in some cases the invented languages are subtitled and in some cases they are not. The Return of the King TV special by Rankin Bass makes use of many of the terms found in the source novels, whereas Raniitelli doesn't use them just as much, but we'll get back to that movie a bit later. In the previously mentioned motion picture adaptations, the creators stuck to the language elements already present in the source material. This stands in stark contrast to later adaptations, which frequently expand on the languages as presented by the novels. As already mentioned, Peter Jackson and his team worked together with David Salo for the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit trilogies, as well as last year's The War of the Rohirrim. Salo created his own versions of Sindarin, Quenya, Kustul, the Black Speech, Orcish, and passages in Old English or the language of the Rohirrim, such as the funerary dirge sung for Helm Hammerhand in the War of the Rohirrim. Similarly, Amazon's The Rings of Power hired a team of Tolkien experts and scholars, such as Karl F. Hostetter, who is the head of the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship. They also worked together with the Tolkien estate and consulted unpublished material. In the first season, the language most spoken was Quenya, though this was then in the second season changed to the more lore-accurate Sindarin. Then we also had passages in the Black Speech and a few in Kustul, and much of it was found in the soundtrack specifically. As we could see, with time there were more and more inclusions of Tolkien's languages, and there are many possible reasons for that. Most pragmatically, nowadays there's much more language material published than before. For example, in 1977, the Silmarillion was published. From the 80s onward, we had the History of Middle-earth books, as well as the linguistic journal Viña as well as since the 70s, the linguistic journal Parma El Dalembaron. There might also be a question of copyright at play. For example, looking through the copyright requests in the BBC written archive, I found that during the 70s, at least, the right to Tolkien's music were separate from the rights for straight reading, and then again separate from rights for dramatization. So there might be something like that at play. Amazon's Rings of Power, for example, as of 2022 at least, only had rights to The Lord of the Rings, including the appendices and The Hobbit. So they never made clear what kind of language material they were allowed to work with. More generally speaking, with the widespread use of the internet, fan communities, including those centered on the languages, are now more visible and interconnected. For example, on the social media platform Reddit, the forums dedicated to Quenya in Sindarin each have more than 8,000 users subscribed to that forum. David Peterson, the person behind the invented languages of Game of Thrones, also claims or states that every aspect of a production is now held to an ever-growing standard and closely scrutinized. This includes the languages. And he also believes that, particularly for fantasy and science fiction, immersion is a crucial requirement that producers have to keep in mind to keep audiences engaged and interested. Tolkien himself talked about this, as I already mentioned, on fairy stories, as well as a couple of his letters where he talked about secondary belief or literary belief. Finally, I believe a lot of it has to do with marketing and franchising. Using Tolkien's languages or parts of them clearly marks a work as a Tolkien adaptation, and thus capitalizes on brand recognition and appeal. And the ring inscription, which you can see below, is probably the most widely used. For example, you can buy ring replicas of the One Ring, which has the ring inscription on it. You can find it on mugs, on cups, on t-shirts, on sweaters. Tolkien himself wouldn't have been happy about that. If you've read his one letter with the mug, he used it as an ashtray. But marketing-wise, it makes a lot of sense. It is the most recognizable element of his languages, I would argue. Now that I've given you a brief overview, I'm going to take a specific example from Tolkien's novels, and I'll be looking at how different adaptations use it. And I've chosen the aforementioned ring verse in its original Black speech for that. The first time it is mentioned is during Gandalf's and Frodo's conversation about the One Ring. In Backend, Gandalf only recites the translation. The actual original Black speech only comes later during the Council of Elrond. In the 1981 BBC radio play, interestingly, as Gandalf recites the English lines, voices in the background say it in the Black speech. Hopefully this works.
There are fiery letters, outside and inside, but I cannot read them.
No, but I can. The letters are Elvish, but the language is that of Mordor. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them.
What does it mean, Gandalf?
When it comes to the Council of Elrond, in the 1981 BBC adaptation, Gandalf gives the black speech version of the ring inscription with no special effects whatsoever. This stands in contrast to the BBC adaptation from 1955, which states that in the background the Mordor theme is played, unfortunately, since no recordings have been found. We don't know what this Mordor theme sounded like. And we are told that Gandalf's voice becomes harsh and menacing, though it is unclear whether this is achieved through any special effects or would have been decided by the delivery of the voice actor portraying Gandalf. In comparison, as already mentioned, the Mind's Eye radio play gives us only the translation and not the black speech version. When we turn to the Lord of the Rings movie from 1978, we find a change between the movie and the novel. Mainly, even though in the novel Gandalf says he will not utter the language of Mordor in Backend, he does so in the movie.
Ash nas debatulu. Ash nas imbatu. One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all. And in the darkness find them.
As you can see, the first two lines of the ring verse in the black speech are not subtitled, while the English portion of it is subtitled. You could also hear that there was some kind of reverberating effect on Gandalf's voice, ominous music played in the background, and I find the way Gandalf gestures greatly and Frodo keeps backing away from him fearfully really adds to the feeling of importance and the ominous character of the scene. Unfortunately for the cinematic release of Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf's recitation of the original black speech was cut out, though thankfully it was included in the extended edition. If you compare this to how Tolkien described the scene in the novel, you find that it is actually very close. The porch visibly darkens, the camera begins to shake, Gandalf's voice changes, and again we have voices in the background speaking black speech, though now they do not repeat the ring inscription but say something different. And as you can see in the GIF below, the elves, they have not stopped their ears, but they look visibly pained. As I said, this was unfortunately cut out of the theater release of the movie. In the movies in general, we only hear it in the background or as part of the soundtrack. It is particularly prominent when the ring influences people around it, particularly the ring bearers and would-be ring bearers Smeagol, Bilbo, and Frodo. It is also often heard when the Nazgul are on screen or nearby. Of the two motion picture adaptations which include the relevant scene, Sagan om Ringen and Granitjelli, neither of them include the original black speech lines and only use the translations. As a brief aside, as you can see in the Russian Granitjelli, for some reason they did not use the Tengwar script on the ring. I've been told by speakers of Russian that it is gibberish, what is seen on the screen. And instead of using Gandalf's rune, they used a capital Latin script uppercase G for his rune. In The Lord of the Rings of Power, the last episode of the first season, as the credits roll, we could hear the song Where the Shadows Lie, in which the English translation of the ring verse is sung. In general, in The Rings of Power, the show uses many of Tolkien's words and a lot of writing, both Tolkien's scripts and an original one for Numenor. The languages are even relevant to the plot. As already mentioned, in the times in which Numenor turned away from the Valar and the Elves, Speaking the elvish tongue Sindarin and Quenya was forbidden, but the faithful elf friends continued to speak it amongst themselves in secrecy. In this scene, in the third episode of the first season, Elendil also speaks Quenya to Galadriel to show her that not all Númenóreans are hostile towards elves.
Go to your gods, or get out of my way.
Lali sanke Louis, where I was raised, many speak it. It is still taught in our Hall of Law, still carved on statues throughout the city.
I want to highlight another scene from Peter Jackson's movies, this time from The Battle of Five Armies, the last movie in the Hobbit trilogy, because it presents an interesting reverse situation. Lines which in the novel are only recited in English, namely 3 rings for the Elven Kings and so forth, are here given in the Black speech, or rather the Black speech version as developed by David Salo.
For mortal men doomed to die.
If you've watched the behind-the-scenes documentary of the movies, you would have heard that Benedict Cumberbatch, who not only lent his voice and motion capture to Smaug but also Sauron, was asked to perform all Sauron lines in reverse, so that the effect of the uncanniness of Sauron's voice and performance would be enhanced. I also want to briefly highlight an interesting element of the line about the Dwarf Kings. Just like some of the words in the Black speech are taken directly from Quenya or Sindarin, for example, Uruk from the ancient Elvish term Uruku, from which derived Quenya Urku and Sindarin Orch, Salo derived some of the words here from Khuzdul terms. So the Black speech word for dwarves seems to be similar to the Khuzdul Khuzd, meaning dwarf. I just found that interesting that he copied Tolkien and paid close attention. In the musical soundtrack, in the song Fly to the Fort, the Dark Voices sing one of the lines of the ring inscription, and it is repeated several times. In that same song, we also get parts of the hymn to Elbereth, as well as some original lines in Sindarin. Finally, when it comes to the many game adaptation of Tolkien's works, the ring inscription or ring verse is either in the foreground, for example, as in the 1988 video game War in Middle-earth, in which it is given complete with a translation on the game over screen, in card games as quotes on the cards and as character lines in voiced video games, or it is found in the background, either as singing or as ominous whispering. Individual words or lines are also in later games taken and used for their own language constructions, which are usually built upon the foundation of Tolkien's admittedly very scarce material on the Black speech. One game or 2 games in particular are the aforementioned Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War. One portion, Agenask, is used when the player uses a particular ability to lure enemies to their location.
Did you hear that?
The same portion is heard when collecting upgrade materials for skills, weapons, that sort of thing, during certain interface interactions, and during certain portions of the menu. It features also prominently in the soundtrack, for example, in the first game at the end of the prologue. It also features prominently in a video sequence or cutscene in which Celebrimbor falls under the influence of the One Ring. Him speaking the voice lines alongside Sauron symbolizes here that he is under the control of the One Ring. In the second game, spoiler, When the main character reveals himself as the newest Nazgul, the ring verse is also heard quite prominently in the soundtrack. As I've already mentioned, most of the songs and poems are among the most frequently cut elements from the novels, which in my opinion is quite a shame because they are beautiful to listen to. Thankfully, Tolkien himself has recorded some of his songs, including Galadriel's Lament, with which I'd like to end this talk. Thank you for your attention.